Hi everybody, this is the fourth day of reading The Lottery by Shirley Jackson, and our final day with this short story. We will finish today. I obviously realized that I was cut off again in the last video. I apologize. I will try and keep the side comments short so we can get through this today. So we left off talking about why the community does the lottery, and we find out through Old Man Warner that they do the lottery because it is their belief that sacrificing someone a year helps them have a better growing season for their crops, okay? And we can see this where it says lottery in June, corn be heavy soon. And honestly, there is some proof, proof I would say in quotation marks, right? Of this maybe being true with the weather in the very beginning of the story, right? When Shirley Jackson opens the short story, she gives a description of the beautiful warm summer day, the flowers blooming, how green the grass is, right? And so obviously those are perfect conditions for growing food for a community. So this kind of backs up this idea, right? Also, I want to mention too that seamless or needless detail that maybe you thought about having the weather, right? That was put in there deliberately by the author. And deliberate means for a reason or for it's specific, right? In books, we have room to add in fluffy details that are probably not needed. But in short stories, everything that is in the short story serves a purpose. There's a reason that the author added that in there. And we saw that with the description of the black box, the description of the weather, and all the little details about what they've taken out of their rituals as far as the tradition of having the lottery goes. So just something to keep in mind, okay? I also want to talk about Old Man Warner's reaction to these different communities getting rid of the lottery, or at least talking about it, right? And I want you to think of Old Man Warner as maybe like you guys call them boomers, but the older generation who is very much stuck in their ways. And by that I mean they believe everything that has happened to them in their lives is the correct way that things are supposed to go. They are very wary of change, like they don't like change, they don't want anything to change because it's always been this way and therefore it should stay that way. And that's how Mr. Warner feels, right? He is 93 years old. I had somebody in the first hour do the math, so that's where we got that number. This is his 77th year doing the lottery, and we're going to see that down here at the bottom. And so he all he knows is the lottery and this community, right? And I want you guys to understand that. These people are born in the community and they die in the community, and there are no alternatives. They can't refuse to participate in the lottery. They can't run away from the lottery. Everything that's happening in this community doesn't change. It stays this way, at least for as far as we can tell, right? Maybe in another short story she'll talk about them changing. But as of right now, all we know and all the community knows is that if they sacrifice one person a year, that will automatically give them a good growing season for their food, okay? So I want you guys to really understand that. Okay, so let's go ahead and continue reading. Some places have already quit lotteries, Mrs. Adams said. Nothing but trouble in that, Old Man Warner said stoutly. Pack of young fools. Martin. And Bobby Martin watched his father go forward. Overdyke, Percy. I wish they'd hurry, Mrs. Dunbar said to her older son. I wish they'd hurry. They're almost through, her son said. You get ready to run. Tell Dad, Mrs. Dunbar said. Mr. Summers called his own name and then stepped forward precisely and selected a slip of paper from the box. Then he called Warner. 77th year I've been in the lottery, Old Man Warner said as he went through the crowd. 77th time. Watson, the tall boy, came awkwardly through the crowd. Someone said, Don't be nervous, Jack, and Mr. Summers says, Take your time, son. Zanini. And there was a long pause, a breathless pause, until Mr. Summers, holding his slip of paper in the air, said, All right, fellows. For a minute, no one moved, and then all of the slips of paper were opened. Suddenly, all the women began to speak at once, saying, Who is it? Who's got it? Is it the Dunbars? Is it the Watsons? Then the voice began to say, It's Hutchinson. It's Bill. Bill Hutchinson's got it. Okay, I don't remember if I mentioned this in the last video, but I was wrong about how the slips of paper are drawn from the lottery box. I was correct in saying that the men draw first, but there are only the same number of papers families in the community and not the number of people. So there's not 300 slips of paper in the box. There's only like, let's say if there were 30 families in the community, only 30 slips of paper in the box, if that makes sense. So each man, the head of the family, comes and draws for his entire family from the box, okay? And then whoever has the mark, in this case it's Mr. Hutchinson, his family is now the target. And his family will have to redraw from the box again to see who in the specific family will be sacrificed, okay? And remember, it can be children, it can be grandparents. There's no discriminating about who is sacrificed in this community, okay? So just a quick reminder. Go tell your father, Mrs. Dunbar said to her older son. People began to look to see the Hutchinsons. Bill Hutchinson was standing quietly, staring down at the paper in his hand. Suddenly, Tessie Hutchinson shouted to Mr. Summers, "You didn't give him enough time. Take any paper he wanted. I saw you. It wasn't fair." "Be a good sport, Tessie," Miss Delacroix said, and Mrs. Graves said, "All of us took the same chance." "Shut up, Tessie," Bill Hutchinson said. "Well, everyone," Mr. Summers said, "that was done pretty fast, and now we've got to be hurrying a little more to get done in time." He consulted his next list. "Bill," he said, "you draw for the Hutchinson family. You got any other households in the Hutchinsons?" "There's Don and Eva," Mrs. Hutchinson yelled. "Make them take their chance." "Daughters draw with their husbands' families, Tessie," Mr. Summers said gently. "You know that as well as anyone else." "It wasn't fair," Tessie said. "I guess not, Joe," Bill Hutchinson said regretfully. "My daughter draws with her husband's family. That's only fair, and I've got no other family except the kids." So, guys, in this instance, obviously everybody knows that, like, who is in whose family and how many members are in each family, right? It's not a very big community, but it's the formality of asking that question. And when Mr. Summers asked Mr. Hutchinson if there's any more in his household, basically he's just seeing how many people are going to be drawing from the box out of that family. So let's say the grandparents still lived with the Hutchinson family. They would be added to the number of the family, right? Or let's say Mr. Hutchinson and Mrs. Hutchinson had an older son who was already married to a woman, but they didn't have kids yet. They technically don't have their own family at the moment, so they're considered still part of the Hutchinson side, and they will have to draw with the family as well. Which we can kind of see where Mrs. Hutchinson talks about her son-in-law Don and her daughter Eva. But as I told you, remember, daughters don't really have a say in this community because before they're married off to their husbands, they belong to their father. They're their father's property. And then once they're married off to their husbands, they're their husband's property. So then they would have to draw then with her husband's family. And that's basically what they're saying, okay? And the reason this is important, guys, is because obviously the more people in a family, the more spread out the chances are of who's going to get picked to be sacrificed, okay? And obviously Mrs. Hutchinson is very freaked out by the idea of maybe her dying or somebody in her family dying. And that's why she keeps saying that it wasn't fair. However, I want to challenge this. Some of you may be thinking, well, she's right, it isn't fair, right? Having somebody sacrificed because it helps corn grow does not seem fair. But I want to challenge you a little bit, and I want you to think about the fact that the lottery is random, isn't it? There's no pre-picked person who's going to be sacrificed. It's all just based off of the luck of the draw. So really, if you think about it, in a way, it is fair. That doesn't make it moral, right? And moral means, good, or that it's justice. But it does mean that it's fair. Okay, so let's kind of continue. Then as far as drawing for families is concerned, it's you, Mr. Summers said in explanation. And as far as drawing for the household is concerned, that's you too, right? Right, Bill Hutchinson said. How many kids, Bill? Mr. Summers asked formally. 3, Bill Hutchinson said. There's Bill Jr. and Nancy and little Dave, and Tessie and me. All right then, Mr. Summers said. Harry, you got their tickets back? Mr. Graves nodded and held up the slips of paper. Put them in the box then, Mr. Summers directed. Take Bill's and put it in. I think we ought to start over, Mrs. Hutchinson said quietly, as she could. I tell you it wasn't fair. You didn't give him time enough to choose. Everybody saw that. Mr. Graves had selected 5 slips of paper and put them in the box, and he dropped all the papers but those onto the ground, where the breeze caught them and lifted them off. Listen, everybody, Mrs. Hutchinson said. was saying to the people around her. Ready, Bill? Mr. Summers asked, and Bill Hutchinson, with one quick glance around at his wife and children, nodded. Remember, Mr. Summers said, take the slips and keep them folded until each person has taken one. Harry, you help little Dave. Mr. Graves took the hand of the little boy who came willingly with him up to the box. Take a paper out of the box, Davy, Mr. Summers said. Davy put his hand into the box and laughed. Take just one, Mr. Summers said. Harry, you hold it for him. Mr. Graves took a child's hand and removed the folded paper from the tight fist and held it while little Dave stood next to him and looked up at him wonderingly. Nancy next, Mr. Summers said. Nancy was 12, and her school friends breathed heavily as she went forward, switching her skirt, and took a slip daintily from the box. Bill Jr., Mr. Summers said, and Billy, his face red and his feet overlarge, near knocked the box over as he got out a paper. Tessie, Mr. Summers said. She hesitated for a minute, looking around defiantly, and then she set her lips and went up to the box. She snatched a paper out and held it behind her. Bill, Mr. Summers said, and Bill Hutchinson reached into the box and felt around, bringing his hand out at last with a slip of paper in it. The crowd was quiet. A girl whispered, I hope it's not Nancy, and the sound of the whisper reached the edges of the crowd. It's not the way it used to be, Old Man Warner said clearly. People ain't the way they used to be. All right, Mr. Summers said, open the papers. Harry, you open little Dave's. Mr. Graves opened the slip of paper, and there was a general sigh through the crowd as he held it up and everyone could see that it was blank. Nancy and Bill Jr. opened theirs at the same time, and both beamed and laughed, turning to the crowd and holding their slips of paper above their heads. Tessie, Mr. Summers said. There was a pause, and then Mr. Summers looked at Bill Hutchinson, and Bill unfolded his paper and showed it. It was blank. It's Tessie, Mr. Summers said, and his voice was hushed. Show us her paper, Bill. Bill Hutchinson went over to his wife and forced the slip out of her hand. It had a black spot on it, and the black spot Mr. Summers had made the night before with the heavy pencil in the coal company office. Bill Hutchinson held it up, and there was a stir in the crowd. All right, folks, Mr. Summers said, let's finish this quickly. Although the villagers had forgotten the ritual and lost the original black box, they still remembered to use stones. The pile of stones the boys had made earlier was ready. There were stones on the ground with the blowing scraps of paper that had come out of the box. Delacroix selected a stone so large she had to pick it up with both hands and turned to Mrs. Dunbar. Come on, she said. Hurry up. Mrs. Dunbar had large stones in both hands, and she said, gasping for breath, I can't run at all. You'll have to go ahead, and I'll catch up with you. The children had stones already, and someone gave little Davy Hutchinson a few pebbles. Tessie Hutchinson was in the center of a cleared space by now, and she held her hands out desperately as the villagers moved in on her. It isn't fair, she said. A stone hit her in the side of the head. Old Man Warner was saying, come on, everyone. Steve Adams was in the front of the crowd of villagers, with Mr. Graves beside him. It isn't fair. It isn't right, Mrs. Hutchinson screamed, and then they were upon her. Okay, so that's the end of our short story, guys. Obviously, it has a pretty grim ending. In case you're confused, the way that they sacrifice people in the community is they stone them to death. They literally pick up stones and throw them at the person who's being sacrificed until they die. So a pretty gruesome way to go if you think about it, right? And the whole reason being that they need to have their crops grow. But I want to challenge that a little bit. I wholeheartedly believe, and you don't have to agree with me, that they don't just sacrifice a person because it helps their crops grow. Think about it. Think about all the stuff that I told you, how there are no alternatives in this community. It's the only way of life they've known, right? I also told you that it was a theme in this short story of the dangers in blindly following tradition, right? And that's exactly what these people are doing, aren't they? They're not questioning conformity. They're blindly following a tradition that really doesn't have any meaning anymore, if you think about it, right? Remember, all of the rituals that they've taken out of the overall ceremony, because it doesn't matter to them anymore if they do it correctly. All that matters is that they cover their bases and sacrifice a person every year, right? Something to think about, okay? We will meet at 12:30 for Zoom. Make sure you answer the questions. If you have any issues, go ahead and email me. And thank you, guys. I appreciate it.